But we have to realize that it's okay. It's okay to have conflict, because it is through conflict that we begin to delineate. We begin to maybe draw a boundary, but that boundary hopefully is flexible enough to where it allows both people to be able to come to some kind of consensus as to how are we going to handle this particular problem that we have. Okay, so damage control is one thing. If asserting yourself is much more important. So again, this particular thing, I think it's a very indicative of the last slide that you just looked at, that being needed equates to being loved in a person's mind when they have grown up in that dysfunctional environment, when they've been parentified, when they have suffered from triangulation, and maybe they still suffer from triangulation. And remember that chaos control causes a person to numb themselves. So I have to numb my feelings, I have to numb my desires, and I have to know that my family role, in a sense, may keep this chaos from emerging. So when we talk about family roles, it's the whole idea that there's the mascot, the one who the child who becomes the clown in the family, because if I'm really funny, then nobody else can be arguing, right? Or you can be the lost child, where the lost child sort of stays away from the family, and everyone says, "Oh, that poor kid, he really is lost. He never comes around." But what that translates into is emptiness. There are other roles that we assume in these kinds of families, where we might be the scapegoat, right? So how many of you were the scapegoat, where basically everyone blamed you and you felt like, oh God, it is my fault. Take it back. It's not your fault, or give it back, I should say. So realizing that these sorts of environments create the kind of mindset that we end up having as we identify with these codependent symptoms, that these come from the environment in which we were in, and we learned them. Okay, we've been conditioned to them, we've been reinforced for them, and that's why they continue. So the way that we'll talk about how we can step back and we can begin to not get so wrapped up in the feelings that do emerge that cause us to act codependently. So some of the personality factors that, if you look at a person who complains of having codependent symptoms, is I've already talked about this kind of this shame proneness and this lower self-esteem, that it causes shame. It really does. That when you feel that you can't control someone else's behavior and you feel it's your responsibility, then you're going to sense shame. You're going to feel like there's something wrong with me. Shame is so damaging, because shame is more about how we feel about our core self. If I just felt guilty, that's a little different. If I feel guilty about something, then I either can stop thinking about that, or I can stop doing that, and then therefore I've remedied the situation. But if I believe, that I am worthwhile, unworthwhile, if I believe that there is something wrong with me, then that creates shame, and there's not a lot you can do about shame, because that's, in a sense, it gets internalized as that's who I am. So that has to be turned around. Arrested ego development. I'm going to talk about that in another slide, but I just wanted to put that out here, where we look at one of the things, that one of the explanations that was given for what codependent behavior is that actually it's just a matter of our ego development being stymied back at an earlier stage, where Erik Erikson would have expected us to be able to know how we feel and to know what we want, that had the developmental process unfolded in a way that nurtured our ego strengths that we would be developing during these different stages, that by the time we got to be a young adult, that we would be ready to be intimate with somebody, that we would be able to know who we are, and we could share who that person is, because we know we know what it is that we need and want. You probably notice that PTSD is in there in the middle there, and what that represents is that PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder, and I think many of us are becoming much more familiar with that now, because we've got so many people coming back from the wars who are being diagnosed with PTSD. That particular diagnosis was at first believed to only apply to those people who had a one event kind of trauma. Okay. So they believed that PTSD could arise from a situation like 9/11. You're in a situation like that, it's horrible, it's a one time thing. Or an earthquake, a horrible earthquake, or the tsunami, or a tornado. Those kinds of traumas could later um, create the symptoms of PTSD, hypervigilance, being very, jumpy, being very jumpy, having nightmares, having flashbacks, being anxious. But what we know now is that we have to extend that diagnosis of PTSD to people who lived in chaotic environments. So those people who grew up in families that were, maybe there was alcohol abuse or drug abuse or sexual abuse or just plain physical abuse. And having to live in that day in and day out creates the same autonomic system arousal of the fight and flight or freeze system. So that is now considered to be a viable reason for the development of PTSD. So I definitely am a big believer of that, because if you are always having to be hypervigilant when you're a child, you are really compromising your immune system. You're compromising your brain, because when our sympathetic nervous system is activated, we're actually, less intelligent. We're not growing, and we're definitely suppressing the immune system, as Bruce Lipton illustrated, and that I discussed in our first webinar. So those are things that really impact a person. And if we're going to move beyond codependence, we need to understand how we can treat the symptoms of of codependence in a way similar to the ways that we are treating PTSD. So this is where we're getting into Erik Erikson's idea of arrested ego development. Okay, so if you are familiar with Erik Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, he basically believed that we are genetically programmed and ready to meet the challenges that are set before us given our age. So each age presents its own psychosocial kind of conflict. And when that conflict is resolved in what he called the healthy direction, then we would end up with what he would call an ego strength. So if you look at this yellow box here, where trust, if we come out of this first stage of trust versus mistrust with a larger sense of trust, then we have hope. Okay, so think about this. It's cumulative, that as I'm going through my developmental stages, right, from 0 to 1, the only thing I have to know to really learn as an infant is that the world is trustworthy. I had all my needs met in the womb, but now that I am out of the womb, are my needs being met? Okay, so that's about all we really need to do. Make sure we creature comfort, eye contact, whatever we can do to help an infant to feel better. That creates a sense of hope. The next stage, autonomy versus shame and doubt. Obviously, we don't want shame. What we want to come out of this stage with is a sense of autonomy. And that sense of autonomy gives us the ego strength of will. And so when my will is intact, and that means that I'm going to be able to go forth. When I have an idea that I want to do something, I have the will to actualize it. Okay? In other words, I haven't fallen into learned helplessness. Because learned helplessness to me is like my will is broken. Because no matter what I do, it doesn't seem to make a difference. So coming out of this second stage with will, the next stage being initiative versus guilt. Okay, when I take a sense of initiative and I can imagine myself doing something different than I've ever done before, even though I might not be able to do it, perfectly, the fact that I can go forth and at least give it a try, I get the sense of purpose. I get the sense that I have a purpose in this world. and I begin to see myself. So the little 3 to 6 year olds, they think they're a fireman, right? They think that they're going to be a cowboy or a cowgirl. They think they're going to be a doctor. All those things we can imagine ourselves to be translates into this wonderful ego strength that, you know what, I do have a purpose. I know what my purpose is, and if I don't know what it is, I can find it. Leading into this large stage of age 6 to 12, that's almost all of grammar school, where it's either industry versus inferiority. So to be industrious doesn't necessarily mean that you're always doing something, but that what you start, you do finish. And what you start and then you finish results in a sense of competence. So we move into there. So if everything goes really well in those first 4 stages up to the age of 12, we've got some pretty good ego strengths there. But as you could probably guess, that from the things that we've talked about already, that the some of these other ego strengths have probably been sort of weak for a person who has grown up in an environment that has been very chaotic. And so we get to this red stage. I made it red to bring your attention to it, because this is the source of, I think, the problems that a person has when they feel that they are codependent, right? Because at this stage of identity, it's either identity versus role confusion. And what Erikson meant by that is that we try on different, we question the role of that we've been given. We question the knowledge we have been given. We question everything. Think of it, the 12 to 18-year-old is now beginning to question what the parents have taught them. Okay, so it seems like a teenager is rebelling, but really what they're doing is they actually are gaining a sense of identity. They're trying to find out, who am I? And if they are allowed and encouraged and nurtured through this period to express their own will, to try these different things, with hopefully some guidance that, that if we tell our children, well, if you do this, these are the consequences I see, and so make a good choice, that if we are given that kind of opportunity, we emerge from this stage with a sense of fidelity. And what fidelity is an allegiance to a set of ideologies, right? So I know how I feel. I know what is important to me, regardless of whether it reflects what my parents taught me. I have come to some conclusions on my own that what works for me is X, Y, and Z, okay? So if I can come through this stage, the challenge of this stage, with that sense of fidelity, then I can enter into intimate relationships where we're looking at intimacy versus isolation, where really if we can learn to be intimate, we can actually learn to love and to be loved. So I think that's the goal in codependence, is that, I'm looking for love, but I don't know how to get it, because you know what? I don't even love myself. So how can anyone love me? So this is where I see that Erikson's theory throws us back to this stage of identity versus role confusion, where a person has not been able to identify their own internal boundaries, so that they could convey to the person when they meet a person, at an older age, that they can be intimate. Because what does intimacy mean? It doesn't mean that I'm going to have sex with you. It means that I know who I am, and I can share with you who I am, but I won't lose myself in doing that sharing, and vice versa. Okay, that is what we would consider to be, the truest form of intimacy, where we really can be accepted by another person, even though they see all our warts. Okay, so that's been one of the most viable, I think, explanations for what codependence is. I know that some of you are probably thinking, well, wait a minute, that's not the way my family was. My family was really supportive. My family was, they listened to me. They honored my boundaries. They respected, my feelings. And in fact, it was okay for me to feel, So what what has been identified is that there's actually two sources of codependence. So that's why I have up here endogenous codependence or exogenous codependence. So if we look at endogenous codependence, endogenous means it comes from within. And those people who would be diagnosed as having what we call endogenous codependence would have basically described that they came from a family that they felt was dysfunctional, where there's probably parentification going on and triangulation, um, where there was, these different characteristics of the family environment that created this particular kind of relationship to other people. There's a vulnerability to developing codependence if you've grown up in that kind of family, and it's interesting that people who come from an endogenous kind of, who come from a dysfunctional family who develop that endogenous kind of codependence, is that they will actually prefer to have relationships that exploit them. And my guess is that the reason why a person would prefer a relationship where the other person exploits you is because then you can try to change that person. And that's probably one of the mantras of a person who has codependence, is that I can change you. I can change you. Nobody knows what's better for you than I do, And that, how many of you have actually fallen in love with potential, right? So there's problematic characteristics that emerge from this kind of codependence. But the exogenous codependence, that was the other group of people who actually came from good families, that they would say were very supportive, but they also said, you know what, I have codependent symptoms, but I didn't grow up in that kind of family. They would describe themselves as coming from stable environments. So this is a reactionary role to a problematic relationship, and more than likely it's if you learned in the family that it was good to, be interdependent on one another, that we should be helping one another, that there were, that in healthy families, I think there is that communal sense that, what I do does affect you. Well, that's healthy. But what happens in a problematic relationship is that those same caretaking, nurturing kinds of behaviors can get exacerbated and therefore become what we would call codependent behaviors. Okay. So I hope that makes sense, that we can see that codependence actually emerges from two different places, and that we don't all have to come from a dysfunctional family to be suffering from these kind of blurry boundaries. I want to talk a little bit about gender differences too. I know I've been talking a lot, and I hope you're hanging in there with me. We have just a little ways to go, and we'll be getting to the point to where I'm going to talk a little bit about what are some of the things that you can do to overcome and heal. I'm not going to talk about recovery. I'm going to talk about healing, because to me, healing implies that you are now no longer afflicted by the same kinds of situations that you were in the past. But I also want to point out here that there is a gender difference between the way males and females react to different kinds of environmental situations and family situations, and that we emphasize different things. So I put in blue what is more of the male affiliation, and in red what is the female affiliation. So males are more oriented towards independence versus females who are more communal and community oriented. We already know that. But when we look at those individual differences, they begin to start looking, the symptoms of codependence begin to resemble that kind of dichotomy. Because one of the things that you'll find is that, like when we get into underfunctioning versus overfunctioning, instead of calling it codependence, can we just say that those people who aren't doing enough in the relationship, that really they're just underfunctioning because the other person is overfunctioning, So instead of using those labels where we're saying you're codependent, people begin to think like they've got a sticker on their forehead that says I'm codependent and therefore there's something wrong with me. That we have to begin to use different kinds of, if we're going to use labels, to definitely change our labels and definitely to define those labels, because otherwise there's misunderstanding. So in codependence, codependent relationships or codependent symptoms, people generally overfunction. But what males tend to do is they underfunction. But they'll underfunction, they'll do less, because I think that's part of the male psyche and physiology. Because when you think of stress, okay? When we are stressed, what happens is the sympathetic nervous system kicks in, right? Well, it's kind of interesting because depending on whether you're a male or a female, there's going to be a different neurochemical that is going to be secreted. Okay, if you're a male and you're stressed, the hormone that is released is called vasopressin. Vasopressin causes you to separate yourself from people and to back away, and actually makes you a little more aggressive. Okay, that's what males secrete when they are stressed. Now, do you think that that's the same thing females secrete when they are stressed? The answer is no, because this makes sense now. Why would a woman overfunction? Well, it isn't just because that's what she's learned, but it's because this chemical in her body called oxytocin. Oxytocin is that cuddle chemical that makes us want to, cuddle our babies when we birth a child, right? So oxytocin is secreted in a female when she is stressed. So that's why what females do when they're stressed is they seek out someone else. They go to their friend, their girlfriend, or they'll go and talk to their mother or whatever, where males will do the exact opposite. And there's actually a physiological explanation for that. So that's a good thing to remember. Because then a female could, in a sense, understand that, okay, you need a little bit of space until we calm down. I'm going to call my mom. Okay, so that's one way to understand it. Contradependence versus codependence, again, it's the same thing. Contradependence means I'm going to separate myself from you. I will be less than dependent on you when stress arises. Whereas what females will tend to exhibit are more of those codependent behaviors. In other words, nurturing, more caretaking. Let me fix it for you. Another thing that when we start looking at the family environment, if there's been abuse in the family, what will happen is that males tend to respond to these kinds of situations in ways that reflect what they call conduct disorder. In other words, aggressive, rebellion, those kinds of behaviors, whereas females tend to, again, gravitate towards being more enmeshed with other people, and that's probably because of their physiology. So we would say that in response to abuse, that females tend to be more dependent, more narcissistic, and borderline ways. So those are like what we call personality disorders. Here's the last gender difference I want to point out here is that depending on whether you're a female or male, you're going to respond to the way you were mothered, okay, differently. Okay, so those females who reported that they, felt that they were codependent, that they had codependent behaviors, they actually reported that they did not get a lot of support from their mother. So it's associated with lower maternal supportiveness for females. But it's just for males, it's interesting. It's higher supportiveness from the mother would translate into codependence for males. So that's another gender difference to consider when you're either working with people who are complaining of this condition, or if you're thinking of yourself. Are you male or are you female? Was your mother supportive or not? Well, depending on whether you're male or female, it's going to make a difference because, for females, we know lower supportiveness from the mother, but for males, it's the mother who is actually more supportive that seems to translate into codependent behaviors for males. So I'm just bringing us back full circle to the personal mythology, because all of this, this whole journey to me has been about our personal mythology, and our personal mythology to awaken our soul, to awaken to our own soul story. It requires that we examine the boundaries that we've created in our lives, and that we know what those boundaries are and where they came from, and that we also create that when we know that where these things came from and how they formed, we've made that space for our soul. So again, to look at this healing model of the personal mythology, it tells me that when I discover the thesis, that means I know that the behaviors that I am exhibiting right now are reflective of codependence, and it's not working for me. When something's not working, then usually it's the opposite that we want to go to, and that, usually the opposite will be what we call the antithesis. But the antithesis is not any more functional than the thesis, because it's the complete opposite. And so if you were very dependent, if you were very controlling, if you were very, seem to be controlling, if you were always nurturing, if you were always taking care of the other people, at this point, when you reach that point of boiling over, you may think that the opposite is better. Okay, I don't need anybody now. I've been around people. I don't need anyone anymore. And so, one of the problems in codependence is that it's been described as a problem within a relationship, but the onus of recovery is on the individual. And it's not the individual who's involved in drugs or some kind of addictive kind of behavior. It's actually the partner. That's why they call it codependent. I'm the partner of someone who is dependent on drugs. Okay, so the whole thing here has been that the person who suffers from codependent symptoms has been taught, through the recovery movement, that they're the problem. And yet this is an interrelationship problem that arises from the intra-relationship, okay? That it takes two to tango, right? So how can you, I think that it's not helpful. I think it's damaging to point the finger at one person in a relationship and say it's your fault, because it's a total complex situation that needs to be sorted through. And that's what synthesizing the two myths is basically I'm going to take the best from the way I have been living. I'm going to look at my arising mythology. I'm going to take the best from that. I'm going to synthesize the two into a new myth. I'm going to refine it, and then I'm going to develop those kinds of activities and behaviors that will reflect my new mythology. So number 5, weave the renewed mythology into daily life. In other words, the next time I feel the need to take care of someone else's emotions because, I feel responsible for their emotions, I'm going to back off. I'm going to take one step back and just say to the person, gosh, I'm really sorry you feel that way. I hope it gets better. Instead of saying, let me fix it for you. Okay, so how can we do this? We got to reframe codependence. It's an opportunity for us to awaken our heart, and by doing that, we deepen our connection to our soul. Our soul has space to arise. Our vitality comes to the surface because now those bubbles in the unconscious have been popped. You get some of your libido back, and your libido is what helps you to move forth in the world and to be present in the here and now, so that you can enjoy everything that's happening around you. And remember that codependence those symptoms have only been the soul's cry for attention, that the soul needs some kind of nurturing. So what can we do? We can learn to be more assertive. Okay, being assertive is not to be aggressive. Asserting just means that I can tell you how I feel. So when I feel something, I now am brave enough to say it. I have the courage. Okay, so we have to identify first, well, what is it that I need? What is it that I want? And then can I tell another person this without dying? Because that's probably what a person with codependence believes, is that if I tell them the truth, they're going to die, or I'm going to die. So, we have to realize that empowerment is what we need. So if I can be assertive, say what I feel, say what I need, without bashing the other person, okay? That means I'm recognizing, expressing my feelings, and also to not nurture other people so much, feel the need to do that, but to remember that I have to nurture myself first, that if I don't take care of myself, how can I take care of other people? Okay? So again, it's like reparenting. Whatever you didn't get from your parent, you now can reparent yourself and give that to yourself. And the last frame there, that white frame there, is to scrutinize the laws, the rules, the norms of values, sanctions, prejudices in society and culture that limit our empowerment. Okay, so that's really important, because when we see the biases that are arising in our country, again, that we have to fight to maintain those kinds of movements towards equality. We can't go backwards, because if we go backwards, then we are falling into that patriarchal um, environment where these kinds of codependent symptoms and relationships are going to be fostered. We need to build our self-esteem boundaries. And one of the things that they talk about, and I already talked about self-parenting, but to stop over-functioning. In other words, that's the same thing, that instead of feeling so responsible for you, I am going to step back and I'm going to let you function and do what you need to do. You know, I am there for you, I support you, but I'm not going to give you the solutions necessarily. I may give you my opinion, but I'm not going to go into trauma if you don't do what I say. Okay. So we can stop shame with self-empathy too. In other words, that when we start to feel a sense of shame, that we need to have more compassion for ourselves and to understand that those spaces in our soul that were filled up with all the junk, that we are loosening that those bubbles, and that we are clearing that space so that our true self can emerge. So we need to, in a sense, be still, and to be more problem focused instead of emotion focused. And here's something interesting: the decentralization of the family of origin trauma. The reason why I put that there is because the people that have reported coming into the therapeutic environment uh, who would describe themselves as having an endogenous form of codependence, they really focus so much on the trauma that occurred within their family. That's pretty much what they talk about, okay, in therapy. Whereas those people who have what we call that endogenous codependence, those people do not talk about so much about family trauma, but they talk about the current situation and those things that are problematic within the relationship now. So that can be another piece of advice for those people who feel that they came from dysfunctional environments, and that there is a uh, way to turn our focus away from those things that are in the past and focus on what is in the present. So empowerment, we have to reframe codependence into a relational focus, okay? Codependence is about one person. Empowerment is about both people. And the way I like to describe this is that, you know what, when we have problems with our partner, it's not me against you. We're on the same side. So let's stand side by side. Let's put the problem in front of us. And now we are standing side by side. The problem is in front of us. Now it's our problem. So it's our problem, and it's something that we can fix together. It's something that we can problem solve. So that's a really, really important thing to incorporate into the ways in which you handle the conflict between you and another person, because you're going to have conflict, okay? Conflict is part of living. It's just how we handle that conflict. I think that's going to make a big difference. And again, when we consider what is the extent of the codependent relating that a person is involved in, again, remember it's on a continuum. It's not like you are a codependent or you aren't a codependent. It's a matter of like, well, which behaviors would I say are not functional for me that I want to change, that would help me to be more autonomous and to be healthier and happier. Group therapy is very helpful for people to be able to, brainstorm together and to share stories. One of the most important things that I find in my classrooms is that when students share their stories, they actually empower other people, because the other people in the class are, they're nodding their heads like, oh my gosh, I get this, I understand this, and this has happened to me too. And so people feel less alone, and that's beautiful, because they feel like, you know what, it's not just me, this has happened to more people. And so let me jump over here to the holistic aftercare, that, that when we're talking about aftercare after therapy, okay, or after a time of therapy, that you also want to consider that the intellectual aspect of the person still needs to be nurtured, and the social, the occupational, the spiritual, the emotional, and the physical, so that it's very holistic, okay, that we are looking at bringing to health all aspects of the person. So some of the experiential techniques that can bring us out of our head and into our hearts and into our bodies, and incorporating our emotions, are psychodrama. In other words, acting out some of the things that we, like, for example, let's say that I have something that I want talk to my husband about, but I'm afraid of what his reaction might be. Now, how can I go about maybe having a conversation with myself to practice what it is that I'm going to say to him, you know? Or that psychodrama might be basically that whole idea that, like, what was it like when I was in that family of origin, and act out those scenes again, so that we begin to, feel the emotion and actually get our bodies into that particular kind of mindset again, so that we can actually grow through it. Journalizing, the empty chair technique, active imagination, relaxation techniques, positive affirmations, energy techniques, qigong. I talk about relaxation techniques and energy techniques because what we need to do is really shift our consciousness. And when we shift our consciousness, that's when space opens up. Our rigid boundaries start to loosen, and we make space for new things to come into our lives. So there's many ways that we can approach this, and I can't cover all of that right now, but there are a lot of resources on the internet or in the book that I'm going to show you. I have a couple books I'm going to show you too that have these kinds of techniques to incorporate into your life. And last of all, this is again the same thing, but I just put a few more things like Aikido, EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. That's a therapeutic technique that is based upon the rapid eye movement philosophy theory, that when we are sleeping and we're having rapid eye movement, that movement of our eyes is helping to consolidate our emotions. So, one of the things we know is that if you don't enter into rapid eye movement sleep during the night, then a person the next day feels exhausted emotionally. They feel sort of strung out. So Francine Shapiro had written about EMDR and how that has been so helpful, helping people to get through past trauma that they had not been able to get through in the traditional techniques. Okay. So the perinatal realm, we talk about the holotropic breath work, where this is Stanislav Grof's work, where now we can access the deeper layers of the unconscious to, maybe discover where some of our feelings come from. Because in the perinatal realm, I think I talked about this in the first webinar, that we do code what the environment was like. Was it a good womb or a bad womb? In other words, was your mother healthy or not? Was she taking drugs while you were in the womb? That would be considered probably the bad womb. Okay, holotropic breathwork takes us through these other nonverbal realms where we can access the emotions and the experiences that we may have had as we were coming through the birth canal. As we were being squeezed in the uterus before the cervix opened, and then as we emerged from the vagina and into the world, those kinds of things those kinds of experiences and feelings that were locked into our psyche during those times can be accessed through holotropic breathwork and art therapy. Okay, so let me just end this by saying that, to be in the here and now, if we can be in the here and now, we can capture our sense of vitality and allow that vital essence of who we are to emerge. And if we can stay in the plane of possibilities, I love this. This is Dan Siegel's work about how when we automatically go to a peak of activation, that means that in our thoughts, we already come to a conclusion about something instead of keeping an open mind. So keeping an open mind means that, I'm going to coast along here, and I'm going to be open to whatever comes before me without any preconceived notions or stories about what is happening. I want to just let it unfold in front of me. So not applying our old storylines is really going to be helpful. Catching ourselves as we're applying those kinds of stories that we've told ourselves that translate into the belief system that we have. When we can begin to change that, we change our attitude, we change our perceptions, and that's going to change our lives. So the last couple things I want to show you is that there is a book, folks, and this is the book that I wrote. This is the friendly version of my dissertation. It's called Breaking the Code of Codependence, Becoming Conscious Through the Transpersonal. And so what you'll find in this book, and some of you who are on this call, I know, or this webinar already have read this book because you've been in my class, and thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you all for being here. And thank you for reading this book and for being interested in this work, because I found it so helpful to me, and sharing it with so many people has really given me my sense of purpose in life, and that is to make your life better. So this book, like I said, it has two different parts in it. The first part goes into the codependent factors, and then the second part of the book goes into how to become more conscious. Okay, so it goes into consciousness and consciousness development, which was the other half of my dissertation. Okay, and I want you to know that this book is available in both paperback form and on Kindle form. You don't need a Kindle in order to get the Kindle app, but you can read this book on your iPhone or your smartphone or any of your readers. And those are both available through Amazon.com. Okay, so just type in the title of the book, Breaking the Code of Codependence, or you can type in probably my name, and I think it leads you to two separate sites. So the Kindle site is separate from the paperback site. Okay. And then my most recent book, and I'm very proud of this is another book I use in the classroom. It's a topical reader, and it has a number of topics which I've outlined there for you on the right. That book is actually a cool format because it comes in a CD. And you not only get it in the CD, it's an interactive CD, so it links up to the web, to the internet, and then you can watch videos that I've linked you to in this book. There are articles in there. There are, there's a search engine in there. And the wonderful thing about this publishing company, ndbco.com, which is where you would buy the book, is that they also will send you a free PDF print version of that text. So it's not only a CD, it's a free PDF version, but also you have access on the internet so that you don't have to carry the CD around with you. You don't have to carry the book with you. You've got it available for you anytime you want to read it. Okay? So thank you so much for listening to all that, and I really hope that you can find some usefulness in what I've talked about and discussed about codependence. And this last slide leads to the whole reason that we put on this webinar, and we still have 2 more to go, but it's all leading, 3 actually, because Kathy's going to give a webinar on Wednesday and Thursday of her week. But it's leading up to this live event where Dr. Stanley Krippner, shaman and professor of psychology at Saybrook University, he is going to be leading us through our soul story, aligning our life with our deepest intentions. Of course, I played with the words there a little bit, but we're going to start out on Friday, September 28th, and we end up on Sunday, the 30th. I will be there. I'm going to lead some Qigong and hopefully some art therapy, and you see the labyrinth there in the background. We will do a labyrinth walk as well. So I want to thank everybody for participating, and I'm going to open up the window for you to download this presentation if that's what you desire to do. All you have to do is click on that right arrow there, and that will start downloading the file. It may take a while, so I'm going to leave this website open so that you can do that. But in the meantime, I'd like to encourage you at this point, if you have any questions, if you would go ahead and go down here to the bottom, and you can type it in there, and I'll see what I can do.